Hello everyone, it's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So this one is going to be quick. It's not going to be a long one. I'm trying to get more familiar with doing live video. It's just something I'm trying to do. I'm even thinking about doing like a 30-minute show of a rundown each day. This one is a big deal though. Steve Bannon is out. Steve Bannon is out. Steve Bannon goes down. Now, Bannon called a liberal journalist, gentleman from the Prospect. Let me find the article. Yeah. So Bannon called the guy from the Prospect. The guy's name is Robert Cutter. It's an article called Steve Bannon Unrepentant. He's unrepentant. This article is fascinating. This article is immensely fascinating. It's fascinating from a few standpoints. Left, right, in the interactions, left, right, in regards to the things that they're trying to achieve or the stuff that they espouse, like the rhetoric they espouse. Divisions in the left, right. Divisions in the right. Like it's like you have to see the undercurrent of it, but it's there. All of it. It's there. It's just kind of out there. It's an amazing article to read. Particularly Bannon's part. Bannon comes across as somewhat complex. Complex is the wrong word for it. He comes across as being more thoughtful. I mean, it makes I have a bad taste in my mouth when I say it just because it's Bannon. You got to understand, Bannon is considered to be a white nationalist. Far, far, far to the right, or alt-right, or whatever you want to call them. The labels are slippery. So take that with a grain of salt. I'm just saying he's considered to be. But some of the stuff he's saying is not crazy. It's not crazy. And because it's not crazy, it is terrifyingly candid. Now, after writing this, he was summarily shown the door. Whether he was fired, whether he quit, whether he had resigned weeks ago, whatever, he was shown the door. Either he's not a stupid guy, and so if he's doing this, what are the reasons somebody would do something like this? Meaning, what are the reasons somebody would come out and give this kind of really candid conversation that undercuts the narrative that your administration was making, or the administration that you were working with was making? Is it spite? Is it just to get a certain amount of information out in the public because he thinks what's going on is a bad idea? Who knows? All we have is what we have in front of us. So let's read this. This is the Prospect. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole piece because the whole piece is kind of long, but I just want to show it. We're in an economic war with China, he added. It's all in their literature. They're not shy about saying what they're doing. One of us is going to be hegemon in 25 years or 30 years, and it's going to be them if we go down this path. On Korea, they're just tapping us along. It's just a sideshow. Right there, that by itself. Now, we knew that they had this thing against globalism, like this, these anti-trade policies, or against these trade policies. I know for myself, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, reading through that was eye-opening. You can't read it and not come away with it thinking this is what these guys are doing. You hear people get called conspiracy theorists when they talk about one world governments and stuff like that. They would literally undercut the United States sovereignty with a foreign tribunal if something adversely affect corporate profits. So they're not just people, they're superhumans that can essentially do whatever the hell they want and get the governments to pay a tab if those governments infringe on them through some kind of regulation or law. That's absolutely amazing. That was what they were trying to pass. He's not crazy. Nobody's crazy. The right isn't crazy for being against these trade deals, nor is the far left. They meet on those aims, which comes up in the article, believe it or not. Now, North Korea is just tapping us along. He's like, dude, that's not the point. North Korea is not a big deal. China is the point. So he's looking at this thing like, yeah, that's the perspective. Bannon said he might consider a deal with China in which China got North Korea to freeze its nuclear buildup with verifiable inspections. The United States removed its troops from the peninsula, but such a deal seemed remote. That's not an insane idea. Look, we take our troops away, and China would inspect you to make sure you don't have weapons. I don't think that's sane at all, particularly for a right-winger. I mean, that's immensely sane for a right-winger on this. I think that's the most terrifying part. I mean, this guy, however you want to put the ideology, it boils down to, this is our nation. We need to keep it a white nation. It was never your nation, dude. You murdered. It was started on the genocide. It was their nation. If you're going to say it was anybody's, I'd argue it's nobody's. This land, this world, it's common heritage. No one was here to give it to anybody. Anything that was taken was actually taken. In this particular case, this was started on a genocide and then built on the backs of slaves. I miss your claim. I miss your claim. And yet, and look, the claim is self-serving. Yeah, so let's be honest about that. But in spite of the claim being self-service, there are aspects of sanity in what he's saying that you just don't necessarily have on the right in normal situations. Let's keep going. We'll talk about it afterwards. Contrary to Trump's threat of fire and fury, Bannon said, there's no military solution to North Korea's nuclear threat. Forget it. Until somebody solves the problem of the equation that shows me that 10 million people in Seoul don't die in the first 30 minutes from conventional weapons. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no military solution here. They got us. Bannon went on to describe his battles inside the... Well, first, that's true, by the way. That's true. You have to deal with North Korea, but you can't necessarily go in there and attack them. You've heard me say it over and over and over again on my channel. Any attack on North Korea will be an immediate attack on South Korea and Japan, both of which are our allies. You have to deal with North Korea in a way that's not a military solution. I mean, yeah, you have to deal with them in a way that's not a military solution unless you're okay with the massive number of casualties that you're going to get. Not just in North Korea for murdering the civilians in that particular country, but also the surrounding countries, surrounding nations. Let's keep going. Bannon went on to describe his battle inside the administration to take a harder line on China's trade and not to fall into a trap of wishful thinking in which complaints against China's trade practices now take a backseat to hope that China, as an honest broker, will restrain Kim. In his head, it's about China. It's not North Korea. This is what he's saying in his head. It's about China. And so he's this kind of advocate of, yeah. North Korea, that's not the problem that you think you have. The issue is China. And because your issue is China, meaning we want to be hegemon in 25, 30 years, meaning we need to keep control. We need to keep ourselves dominant. Every system wants to persist itself. It's just the way it is. We need to stay on top. We need to stay dominant. Because he feels that way. He's like, don't allow your want for China to deal with North Korea to be a hedge to dealing with China. Meaning, don't let him put that on the table if you guys are actually having this conversation. Don't let him put it on the table. Whatever it is, North Korea is a dog and pony show. The problem is China. To me, Bannon said, the economic war with China is everything. And as we have to manically focus, and as so, we have to manically focus on that. If we continue to lose it, we're 5 years away, I think 10 years away at most, hitting an inflection point from which they'll never be able to recover. I don't quite know what that one means. I assume what he means is if the trade deficit, if the way our trade is arranged with China, if that continues, in his mind, 5 or 10 years, something happens. Bannon's plan of attack includes a complaint under Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act against China coercion of technology transfers from American corporations doing business there, and follow-up complaints against steel and aluminum dumping. We're going to run the tables on these guys. We've come to the conclusion that they're in an economic war and they're crushing us. But what about the internal adversaries at the Department of State and Defense who think the United States can enlist Beijing aid on North Korean standoff, and the Treasury and National Economic Council who don't want us to mess with the trading system? Oh, they're wetting themselves, he said, explaining that Section 301 complaint, which was put on hold when these war threats when North Korea broke out, was shelved only temporarily and will be revived in 3 weeks. As for the other cabinet departments, Bannon has big plans to marginalize their influence. That's amazing. That's amazing. He's like, yeah, they're wetting themselves, but I'm going to put them on ice. I didn't realize Bannon had that power to do that. That's amazing. That's absolutely amazing. But he's dead set on the China thing. Now, the other part to this, let me see. The other part to this has to do with, well, he's going to try to get Hawks in to push his strategy through. I got to be honest, I don't know enough about the China thing. I know we have a trade deficit with China. The problem is capitalism. The problem is not China. You may say China is doing something that he doesn't particularly like, but you're in a capitalistic model. They just so happen to have a state capitalistic model. They're trying to maximize their profit the same way you're trying to maximize your profit. Is an American worker going to drop jobs? Meaning, is he going to say, okay, I'm not going to pay this guy $15. I'm going to go to that country and pay that guy $3. He's a capitalist. He's trying to lower his profits. I mean, trying to lower his costs. So yeah, he's going to do that. Is he going to buy materials from a country that's selling it for dirt cheap? If he can, if he can, then yes, he's going to do that. He's trying to lower his costs. He's a capitalist. What do you expect him to do? It's one thing if you provide some kind of disincentive to the behavior, but even countries at this point that are in economics are going to go for it. His issue with China, look, China doesn't have the regulations that we have. It's like China, how can I say this? China does capitalism a little bit better than we do because they have full control of the political apparatus. Like in our places, we have businesses that are kind of bumping heads doing their own thing. In China, it's organized. The government mandates what's necessary. We call it, a communist country or whatever, but for the most part, it's just state capitalism. What he's talking about as an economic war, he's making the point that China is specific in regards to economics because their government can, for the most part, control how they arrange themselves. So in his mind, we're at an economic war with China. We need to do something about it. I don't know enough about it to comment on it. The bottom part, however, this part, we got to do this. The president's default position is to do this, but the apparatus is going crazy. Don't get me wrong. It's like every day he's talking about hawks on China to get more hawkish. Bannon explained his strategy is to battle the trade doves inside the administration while building an outside coalition of trade hawks that includes left as well as right, hence the phone call to me. He's trying to find people who are on the left and right, people who essentially toe his line, going outside the typical party apparatus to do so, meaning this is something that left and the right kind of agree on. Because we agree on this, we can meet on this particular point. That's his thinking. Now, the bottom part is the best part, because this is what I've been screaming about for God knows how long, and Bannon is finally hitting it. And progressives have been, some of them have been screaming about identity politics. Leave identity alone. This country is not where you think this country is. At least I think Democrats think this country is in a fundamentally different place. It is not. I asked Bannon about the connection between his program of economic nationalism and the ugly white nationalism epitomized by the racist violence in Charlottesville and Trump's reluctance to condemn it. Bannon, after all, was architect of the strategy of using Breitbart to heat up white nationalism and then rely on the radical right as Trump's base. He dismissed the far right as irrelevant and sidesteps his own role in cultivating the ethno-nationalism. It's losers. It's a fringe element. I think the media plays it up too much. We got to help crush it, help crush it more. These guys are a collection of clowns, he added, from his lips to Trump's ears. The Democrats, he said, no longer talk about identity politics. The longer they talk about identity politics, I got them. I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity, we go with the economics, we can crush them. I never before spoken with Bannon. I came away from the conversation with a sense of both savvy and recklessness. Yeah, so did I. Because on this, who's right. So, Democrats go with this idea. On the left, we assume that the rest of the country is like us. And I'm talking about the full spectrum of the left. So you're going to have libs who abhor racism because they themselves are somewhat still uncomfortable with race. Let's be honest when we're having a conversation. In their discomfort with race, they tend to be more animated in it. It's like Worf being raised by Earth parents, making himself more Cleon. So it's like they tend to be hyperreactive, in regards to the issues of identity and everything else. Democrats run on this idea of identity. So for them, it's like, oh, we have all these people stirred up on this idea of multiculturalism and everything else. That sounds great. But you have another half of the country. The majority of the country is white. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that the majority is overtly racist or overtly dislikes anybody. The multiculturalism thing may be perfectly fine for them. But it doesn't necessarily mean it takes them to the polls. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a winner. So when Hillary Clinton is running on this thing like having the black vote is the most amazing thing in the world, that's nice. We make up 13% of the population, though. We're rabid at voting for Democrats, but we make up 13% of the population. So put it in perspective. Democrats may get Hispanics. That's true. But again, that's a minor part of the population. Whites still have a majority. So this idea of trying to be the party of multiculturalism versus the party that's not a winner for you, dude. Which this last election showed. Yes, you can get 3 million more votes, but you still have to win. You still have to win. We don't base ours on the popular vote. Not just that, you lost everything in the states. In addition to every level of government. Your strategy of identity is not working. It's not working. Don't take it from me. Take it from your failures. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean that the country is overtly racist or anything else. African Americans, let's inspect why people vote. African Americans, we vote out of a certain level of fear. We understand the boot of American power. We get it. Not just understanding the boot of American power, we also understand that one of the parties was more conciliatory. They were like, hey, come on in. We can use your vote. The Democratic Party. Now, in knowing that, you knew that the other party harbored people who disliked you a lot, hated your guts. Whether it was the entirety of the party or not, didn't really matter. The fact that you had people in that party that hated your guts was a problem in and of itself. And in one case after the next, you understood not to vote Republican. It's more than tribal. There's an element of, it's like if you've ever been harmed before, it stays with you, it sticks with you, it digs in your head in that sense. It's not just this mental conceptual thing, it's this real thing to you. So African Americans vote Democrat. Keep the goblin out of office. Here's my vote. Hey, who's running? I don't know. Here's the D. Keep the goblin out of office. Well, whites don't have that issue. It's irrelevant. I mean, when you're talking, like if you're African American, you had a conversation with whites, this would be pretty common. They would mention a Republican or a Democrat, and they would regard both of these people as being equals. If they would say, well, the difference is it's a choice. It's a choice. That's not that way for us. Ultimately, when whites make their vote, it's not a situation of them necessarily feeling that anybody who comes in would oppress them or would adversely affect them based upon some arbitrary thing of race. It's not there. It doesn't matter. So if that person is saying something that's somewhat hateful, mildly hateful, veiledly hateful, it could be ignored. particularly if an economic message is on the table. Ugh, I don't necessarily like what he's saying, but at the very least, he's talking about something that's going to affect me. Now, mind you, Trump's lying, but it doesn't matter. One party's talking about identity, something that he doesn't care about, and maybe even thinks that this is talked about too much. And the other party is being somewhat racist, maybe somewhat sexist. And let's even take out the other part, just being Donald Trump, being somewhat of a klutz. But he is talking about an economic message. And in talking about that economic message, he is going to trounce your identity every time. He's going to trounce it. The country is not where you think it is. And I'd say that. I don't say that in a bad way. I said that in this way of kind of just resigned to, if, and look, whites aren't necessarily crazy for this, at least not fully. Like, as an African American, like, put yourself in their context for the moment. They don't have your experiences. They don't see it. Like, to them, this idea of cops abusing African Americans, many of them don't see it. It's oblivious to me. So when, what's his name, gets in office, Jeff Sessions gets in office, they may say something about pot, but they may not say anything else about the drug laws that he's putting into place. Or, not drug laws, but rolling back some of the regulations that Eric Holder did to prevent disparities in drug sentences, meaning African Americans get longer sentences, whites don't. Well, that affects, well, it doesn't affect me in that particular sense, but it affects people like me. I'm certainly bothered by that. That's certainly one of the reasons why I wouldn't put a Republican in that office. And yet, that's not necessarily an issue for them. So they don't see this stuff. So to whites, they have two choices. Maybe even three. Maybe even four. It doesn't work like that for us. So that's I guess my point is, if you're going to run with this identity thing, that doesn't necessarily get you the widest audience. In fact, it limits your audience, and it creates this kind of schism. It alienates your other audience. So yes, I'm hugging African Americans, I'm hugging Hispanics, I'm hugging all this multiculturalism, I'm hugging all of this stuff. You know, you have another part of the country, right? And yes, when you talk about multiculturalism, yes, they're also part of it because they're cultural. They're just one of many. They don't feel that way. They don't think that way. They may dislike some of the stuff that the Republicans are talking about, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to toe your line, particularly if they get hit with an economic message. Bannon is right. Bannon is right. The longer we talk about identity politics, I got them. I want them to talk about racism every day. If the left is focused on race and identity, and we go with the economic nationalism, we will crush the Democrats. He should have put again. He should have put again. I'm putting an article at the bottom. It's an interesting read, man. It's one of those things where it gives you a bad taste in your mouth when you're like, this guy's a racist, and yet he's right about how the Democratic Party is going to lose the election. and not just that, by the way. Wouldn't you want Bannon in that office as opposed to who's in there now? Meaning, at the very least, you would have had somebody, yes, he may be racist, but so is Trump. Meaning, I guess what I'm saying is there a difference between two people who you consider racist being in the same room as opposed to one? And again, I know this stuff is relative, so I know people hate me saying this sometimes, but take it as relative. I'm far to the left. I think people should be left to their devices. This idea of saying it's somebody else's country or it should be held as a white country, this stuff is nonsense to me. So yeah, I consider that to be some racist, just by definition. If you're saying you're a white nationalist, you're defining your identity by your race. But understand that there's an element to that you're going to agree with. Not the white part, but the nationalist part, in the sense of we don't like these trade deals. These trade deals are hurting our country. We need to do something about these trade deals. That type of rhetoric, that type of understanding, or that type of thinking. We need to bring resources into the country as opposed to externally from the country itself. We need to preserve our particular country. Now, he's talking in the context of a war with China in regards to economics. I would imagine the left is talking about this kind of renewal of jobs and so forth. Yeah, it gives you a bad taste in your mouth as you read it and you're listening to what he's saying. And you're like, well, on that point, he's right. And he may be a detestable human being, but he's at the very least one that's talking about not attacking North Korea, having a bit of sanity with regards to North Korea. And it's pretty much has a blueprint to how to beat the Democratic Party in the next election. So I'll leave it at that. All right, guys. Oh, I forgot this was on live. Let's see. Stupidity doesn't discriminate. Oh, by the way, so my Counterpunch article, I did get some criticism on it, and not just the article itself, other people. Look, this channel, it's my goal is just to be brutally honest on how I see it, and there's a point sometimes where politics is conflated with philosophy, and there's an intersection point where those two things meet. This is one of them. This is one of them. The moment that any of those protesters, be it Nazis or they're people there to contest the Nazis, the moment that a punch is thrown, the moment that somebody swings something, that person should go to jail. So it's not a situation where it's like, hey, you're trying to protect the Nazis' right to be violent. Fuck that. If that Nazi is being violent, that Nazi should be in prison or jail. Period. It's not that. If that Nazi is marching and that Nazi is just marching and saying bad things, and that Nazi has a legal justification to be there, at the very least a legal right to be there, I can't say anything about it. It's just a situation of, I don't want to get rid of this idea of free speech over a Nazi rally. Fuck that. They're in dying light. They're dying of irrelevance. This younger generation, these groups that are coming in are not getting more racist, they're getting less racist. They're going to die of irrelevance. The economic system, the stress that we put our people under to some degree creates the factors that exacerbates that thought process. But there's nothing that you're going to do, there's nothing you're going to say to get those people to not be that particular way. And for as long as those people are Americans, those people should have the right of free speech, just in the same way that I want the right to free speech to march, in the same way the flat earthers want the free speech to march. Whatever the group, I don't have to like it. I don't have to like it at all. I don't have to listen to it. It's just the principle of free speech. Do I want to remove my free speech rights over a goddamn Nazi rally? It's 500 out of, what, 325 million people in this country. They're irrelevant. They're irrelevant. That being said, the moment that anybody gets violent, yes, they need to go to jail, at least in this particular context. Even if somebody is antagonizing them to some degree. But that goes for both. If the people who are there with this kind of moral high ground to be there is being violent, then yeah, they should be taken in the same way. I don't want violence started in either case. I don't want people getting injured in either case. It's just this kind of you know, it's like, how do human beings react when they feel like they're being challenged? Say it's not a Nazi. Say it's a regular person. You're aggravating the shit out of a regular person. How is that person going to respond? Now say that person was a Nazi. You're aggravating the shit out of a Nazi. How do you think that Nazi is going to respond? And is it foreseeable that the Nazi is going to be pissed off and try to respond in violent ways? He's a goddamn Nazi. I mean, come on. Let's be honest. So, no, nobody should be violent. Yes, the cops should have intervened when he saw the violence. But let's not pretend that we didn't necessarily think there was going to be violence between a Nazi rally and an anti-Nazi rally. Let's also not pretend that this is not a significant issue if at every Nazi rally across the United States, the press inflates the severity of it. And inflating the severity of it, you draw more people to their cause, in which case you draw more opponents to their cause. And at multiple location after location, after each particular time they go to another location, they get more press attention, which gets more members. You have a constant street fight in one place after the next, with a rising police presence to separate the two forces and factions. Charlottesville would have been completely irrelevant if nobody knew that the Nazis were there in the first place. Nobody would have known. Nobody would have cared. So, that's all I'm saying. This is not a supporting a Nazi thing. This is not a backing up a Nazi. This is not supporting any hate group at all. Fuck those groups. I think what they stand for is detestable. But I have a historical context. And I know governments misuse powers that they get. So yes, today it's Nazis, tomorrow it's people who are speaking out about terrorism, saying, hey, the government is killing people. Yeah, that guy's a terrorist. He's doing speech that we don't particularly like. I don't want any law of infringement that's going to adversely affect somebody else that's on the right side of history. That's the point. That's what I'm getting at. At the end of the day, I don't want the government curtailing other people's rights based on some bullshit that these Nazis were doing. It's like, hey, the government has this power now, out of article whatever of something that took place in 2018 where you had 500 Nazis. Maybe even not even that much. It's just, come on, man. Their point was to be obnoxious. Their point was to be violent and aggressive. Whether you realize it or not, those guys were holding flags as if they were still fighting for Dixie. And when you had those protesters out there, their worldview in their head that the white man was being oppressed, that the white man was being undone, was affirmed. They were out there fighting with sticks and shit. It was the weirdest shit you've ever seen in your life. Where did the swords come from? All this is just weird and bizarre in general. I don't want this violence. It's one thing if I thought they were an actual threat. Then yeah, okay. I don't think they're a threat. I think they're irrelevant. I think right now they're being used as a shiny object. I'm not participating in the shiny object thing. That's what it boils down to. Michael Stapleton, are you in favor of a petty life march? Pedophile march? Are those pedophiles attacking anybody? Are those pedophiles trying to get kids? Depends on what the pedophiles are doing. I'm not for or against it. It's not for me to be for or against it. Am I for pedophiles? No, I'm not. I'm not. So, if I understand what your point, you're trying to say, well, are you free speech absolutist? Yes, I'm somewhat of a free speech absolutist on this. No, I don't think you should cry fire in the theater. No, I don't think you should say anything that's, you know, like that's going to cause harm to somebody else. Like Bill O'Reilly being on TV talking about the baby killer and all this other stuff, and somebody ends up killing the guy. No, I don't want nobody kind of violent rhetoric like that. That's fair. So I guess I'm not an absolutist in that particular point. But dude, if somebody is an American and you get their things, meaning their whatever they need to march, it's on them. What I think about it is besides the point. Yeah, what I think about it is besides the point. It's not for me to say what other people do or what other people collaborate themselves around. Would I be shocked by such a march? Not really. Will they be able to get the necessary permits? Probably not. No, I understand your point. I just, it's not for me to be for or against. That's all I'm saying. And no, I'm not for it. I'm completely against it. But me being against it doesn't really matter. Pedophile. No, I know you're talking about, Mike. Michael Stapleton. Free speech means freedom to stop the march. No, you can't infringe upon their march. Or you can't infringe upon their free speech. That's the catch. You can respond to it. You shouldn't be able to infringe upon it. And if you're going to say we can infringe upon anybody's free speech, then they can infringe upon yours just as readily. You're talking about a moral high ground that's different. Morality and law, those things are slippery subjects. It's like you being in a court case. The job of that particular court case is not necessarily to find whether or not you were in fact innocent or guilty. Is based upon what they can prove. You can be guilty of sin. If they can't prove it, it doesn't really matter. You can be innocent as can be. If they try to prove it and the jury goes along with it, you're going to prison. This free speech is free speech. You have the freedom of speech. Doesn't mean it's going to be good speech. It could be absolutely abhorrent speech, but it's still free speech. This idea that you can stop somebody else from speaking is amazing to me. That would completely decapitate this any idea of the First Amendment. First Amendment doesn't really matter if you can impede upon somebody else's speech. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't respond. You could have had counter marchers. Did the counter march need to be right there in front of them? And certainly you knew what was going to take place if you were right there in front of them. I agree with those people who said the police shouldn't have let it get that far. Fair enough. Fair enough. I don't trust the police as is. Do I really trust them to try to hold back something that I knew was infinitely predictable? Not so much. Yeah, Luca. The catch is peacefully. The catch is peacefully. And the last thing I want to do is elevate them. Like even having this conversation now, I find it to be irrelevant. I find it to be utterly irrelevant. Now we're talking about it. Now America is filled with races. Now there's racists trying to eat your babies and your dogs. They're all over the place. The world's full of racists. They were already there, dude. They were already voting in the Republican Party. They were already in your country, in your neighborhood, in your state, in your locality. A bunch of them got together and had a march. What to fucking do? I don't care. Look, whether those lax cops were with it or not, I just assume. It sounds bad, man. I wouldn't be shocked if some of those cops were, you know. There's a distinct difference in how they responded to protests in Ferguson and protests here. I mean, they had tanks and everything, but for this, good Christian white men aren't going to do anything violent. Well, that wasn't true. It's funny. This was meant to just be a quick one. Yeah, I can just cut the video afterwards. Yeah, guys, I gotta be honest. I'm sick of talking about the Charlottesville thing. I find it's politics. It's not a real conversation. It's just politics. That's what annoys me about it. It's a shiny object. Like, I understand people having a reaction to it, like, oh my God, that's horrible. What took place? What 5% of the world's population, 25% of those people are in our prisons. It's like, if you want to be outraged, there's a lot of shit you could be outraged with right now. It didn't take Charlottesville to do it. You could be, at this very moment, you could lose your shit. All those people in prison, all of those bodies, black, white, Hispanic, whatever the color, are in a cage right now for nonviolent drug offenses. They didn't hurt anybody. They had a choice. They were doing something that they themselves chose that they wanted to do, and they're in a cage for it. I'm just saying, man, if you want to be outraged, you don't need Charlottesville. You don't need Charlottesville. Particularly when you start probing into this idea of, you know, the number, like Blacksmith, it was like 2.5 times more likely to be locked up for pot, longer jail sentences for the drugs, all this stuff. The way the policing is done, like in Baltimore and some of these other countries, even in Ferguson, where they did the analysis, the Justice Department, was deplorable, absolutely deplorable. You had cops essentially looking specifically in those particular neighborhoods, stopping people of a particular color. And then they would turn around and say, hey, well, you know, those blacks, they, you know. If you focus on anything, you're going to find it. And all of the groups, the racial groups, use pot, same amount. So you can't say, well, yeah, that's because they use it more. No, it's not. It's not. There are metrics, there's statistics. It's not just one of those things of somebody overtly saying, I believe XYZ is taking place. You can look at those things. You can look it up for yourself. Yeah, man, I'm just tired of talking about Charlottesville. I don't mind issues of race. I don't mind issues of any of that stuff. It's just the conversation seems to just boil around to whether or not people think this is a case of free speech. I mean, it's like there's a lot of talk and a lot of conversation on whether or not the thing was free speech. I understand that. And I understand how vulgar it is. Meaning, oh my God, this is a vulgar display of racism in our country. I get that too. But it's like this kind of tap on the shoulder, like, dude, we have all this other stuff. Can we also get to this? Can we get to these things? That's all. Yeah, that's all. It explodes in the media, and people are like, oh my God, look at what happened in Charlottesville. Garnome, I'm starting to think that Antifa and many fringe elements are under the direction of consolidated interests. I have no idea. Yeah, I have no idea. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, whether they were or weren't, it's still a group of adults going somewhere. And look, it's not that their aims aren't good. I guess I said I don't know their aims. I mean, they're making the point that they're there to contest races wherever they find it. That's fine. Let's just be clear, though. There's a difference between contesting, you know, your own free speech, but your free speech can't infringe upon somebody else's, even if it's something you don't like. It's one thing if there's being violence and intimidation. We have a violent culture. I would argue that there's a lot of violent stuff that happens to you throughout the course of the day. But it's one thing if somebody's being violent or anything else, then yeah, have at it, do your thing. But yeah, I'm immensely uncomfortable with this idea of infringing upon free speech to the degree where it just causes street fights or violence. Yeah, that's all. I don't know if it's under consolidated interest. Oh, Carpenter, thank you. Good looking out, man. Appreciate the super cash. I don't know how to pronounce your name. Is Anna? Anna 3? I don't think we should erase history. I think you're talking about taking down the statues. You know, I'm fascinated by this. And it's funny. I feel like I should have a strong opinion one way or the other, and yet I can't seem to dredge up one. I understand why people want to take them down. I understand why people want to keep them up. Well, we'll put it this way. I understand why some people want to keep them up. No. I understand why people want to keep them up. So, from the standpoint of taking them down, it's the heart of the Confederacy. When we lost the war, it wasn't like Germany losing the war where it was totally destroyed and demolished and everything was, you know, every rock was bombed at least once or twice. Well, the South settled for peace. The country came back together. And the South looked at it as, well, these guys, these heroes were, you know. But mind you, this wasn't, if I'm not mistaken, those statues went up like way far after the Civil War. Well, actually, I don't know when the statues went up in Richmond. But from one side, it's not necessarily the removal of history that I think bugs people. Put it this way, taking down a statue doesn't change what took place. That's the first point. The second point, though, is I understand the perspective that says creating a statue to somebody who's a terrorist is problematic. I understand that the South has this kind of esteem in itself, in a sense, you know, this kind of thing for the Civil War. They were a band of terrorists trying to protect slaves. Making an icon of them in a statue. You can understand why people would take issue, why that would be somewhat disheartening. You're driving by this statue that's being, you know, praised, whatnot. Even though you know, for the most part, that guy was fighting to keep slavery. Essentially keep you in bondage. So that's understanding the perspective from certain people's standpoint in society. You know, blacks, leftists, liberals, that type of thing. The right perspective is interesting to me. It's interesting to me because to them, it's also wrapped up in this idea of identity and culture and those type of things. So it's taking down a sign. It's not just taking down a sign. It's taking down some aspect of them. Some aspect of me is being removed. This is an unraveling of my dominance in this particular society. So it's not, you know, this is a white country in that sense. No, they're taking down these edifices that indicate such a thing. They're trying to unman, you know, they're trying to essentially take away these things that we ourselves identify with. I think that's where it's coming from. I think there's a certain level of identification with the South in that sense. And not just identification with the South, it's also this thing that this other group wants to do it. It's both. It's one thing if they came to the conclusion themselves and say, we want to take the statue down. It's another thing for another group that you may feel yourself being somewhat opposed to. Because you do have a schism in your society, meaning whites versus blacks. You look at the political parties. If you're looking at this from the sense of a political situation, you would have Democrats who are saying, take the signs down, and Republicans saying, keep those things up. There's no difference. That is the schism that you're getting. When you're looking at these city councils battles, for the most part, you're getting this thing of, these people want the signs down. And then you have other people saying, yeah, that's right. It happened in that state. I want it down too. I want that Confederate flag down. I want that particular monument down. You can see how people who aren't necessarily on this bandwagon of, you know, they may be okay with, okay. You're not slaves. And we're not back in the 60s. But goddamn it, I don't want you taking that statue down. Yeah, I think people identify with those things. I think it's a combination of identification and a combination of, I don't want to do this under pressure or under duress. Like, I don't want them to tell me to do it. I don't want them to feel like they won something and getting it down. I think it's a combination of things. I think just as human beings, this over identification with these edifices that represent aspects of them and their heritage. I would imagine taking them down feels like taking some aspect of yourself from out that particular society and some sort of a mark on the society itself. It's interesting because I don't know how you resolve something like that. It's too easy to say, well, those guys are racist. It's harder to say, how did they get that way? And to stop going with this idea of this is purely some kind of just individualistic choice. Oh, they're individuals. They just made the choice as individuals. It's themselves to blame as individuals. Certainly, you know you're ensconced in a society. And you would not take any particular position that society doesn't necessarily knock you into. At some point, you may evolve past it, but initially, you are encased in that particular society. You may be geared a particular way, but ultimately, you are exposed to something, and that society kind of nudge you in a direction. You can call somebody a racist. That's easy. You can call somebody a white alt-nationalist or whatever those things are, whatever the labels, the pejoratives. You can call them whatever you want, but you also have to put your society on blast, saying, "Okay, how did these people get to the point of getting, reared in this way, to thinking in this way? What experiences did they have to kind of push them in this particular direction?" I'd wager that those are elements of your society. That's not necessarily somebody coming up within a bubble. Tribalism, man, it is difficult to put down. It's difficult to put down. Alright, guys, I am going to call this a night since I got to be honest. I did not plan on even being here this long. Oh, yeah, and I am from Virginia. Born and raised. August 31st, 6:05 a.m. at MCV. If you're from Virginia, you know what MCV is. Yeah, I'm from Virginia. I'm in Richmond. We have a ton of Confederate statues. We started adding African American statues. Billboard Jingles Robinson, tap dancer. He lived the life of he was a tap dancer. He was an entertainer. There was other elements to him. I don't remember him, but yeah, we have other elements that we've been adding. But we have a lot of statues here. We have a lot. Yeah, it's 17. That's what I meant. I knew it was like in the 1900s. Like it wasn't at the Civil War. It was almost like done to put a thumb in people's eye. Marilyn Scoria. Here's some right perspective. Those statues are Democrat who invented the KKK, something Democrats don't need anymore. Well, yeah, there was a flip, a polarity flip. At one point, you had Democrats being the put it this way: the Republican Party was the party of Abraham Lincoln. So that gives you some idea of what the Democratic Party was. But no, those flipped. Martin Luther King wasn't a Republican; he was a socialist. I'm sorry, you got your facts wrong. You have your facts immensely wrong on that one. MLK was a socialist. And there's a straightforward reason why. If you listen to some of the lectures between Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, there's a ton of them online that goes back in the 60s. Fascinating. Martin Luther King realized that the capitalistic society produces certain vagaries, certain problems. There's certain things that the thing was kind of coming off of the wheels. Not just that, it created immense inequities in regards to how cash flowed through a society, particularly through issues of war. Meaning, if you have a fiscal incentive to go to war, guess what? You're probably going to go to war. From a domestic standpoint, go back to the ideas of like LBJ. You're in a capitalistic system. Your system, or your freedom, is determined by your range of capital. How much money do I have in my pocket? That's going to determine where you can go, what you're going to eat, where you're going to vacation. That determines your life. Scarcity and excess, meaning this ability to be somewhat free. Without capital, there is no freedom in a capitalistic society. Now, you had people who were originating from slaves who started with nothing, squat, didn't have anything. They weren't bought over because they wanted to be bought over. They were bought over by force. They were cut loose. You're free. Many of those people were still like serfs working the land after they were granted their freedom, because where were they going to go? 1900s. Even up to, you have this Harlem Renaissance of sorts. But you still had African Americans that were locked out of industry, locked out of jobs. It was immense poverty. That's what I'm getting at. Immense poverty. What he understood was that he was in a country that was racist. You're talking about the 1960s in America. He understood that those people were going to be kept out of particular jobs and everything else. And so he understood that a capitalistic system which incentivized this kind of me first attitude. First, he was a minister. The man had a sermon called why did Jesus call the man a fool? He's talking about somebody being rich. And Jesus called the man foolish because he wasn't putting his money in people's bellies and building homes. That's not a Republican. I'm sorry, you got your facts wrong. It's the opposite. The guy wasn't even a Democrat. The guy was a socialist. Yeah, Southern strategy. The issue is class, not race. Race was the biggest trick played on whites in this country. I stand by that. I'll stand by it. Because it's this idea that, you look, those, even during slavery, many of the whites didn't have slaves. Most didn't have slaves. It was only the upper crust. People could afford them. Now, so you have a situation where dirt, poor whites are there. But from a societal standpoint, we don't have anything, but we're better than them because of our skin. Think about that. Like, think of the amazing trick that is. It's not looking around thinking to themselves, I don't have two nickels to rub together. It's at the very least looking, I'm not at the bottom rung of this society. That's a massive trick that's been played. The honest reality of it is, you're in the same economic boat with the people you hate. All those people are there with those statues and everything else. And the Antifa people who are out there to contest them. And yeah, you can say they were morally higher in that sense. They were. They went out there to oppose hatred. So give them credit where credit is due on this point. I don't like the outcome. I don't necessarily like the methodology or the tactic. But I understand and respect what they were doing. All of those people probably were in the same economic boat. They're at each other's throats. They're at the same economic boat. If those people were functioning as a collective unit, meaning if they could put their hatreds to the side, they would have been in a better place. 95, 96, 99% of the country are in the same boat. Hell, let's say 95% to be on the safe side. The same boat. Same boat. That's immensely disheartening. That's immensely disheartening. The issue is class. The issue is not race. Those things are points that are used to divide people. The division is completely unnecessary and arbitrary. It's not arbitrary. It's done down tribal lines. I'm just saying this division in society, these petty dramas, overwhelming majority of the people, for the most part, are in the same boat. And not just that, the majority of the people agree on certain core issues. Those core issues are not necessarily espoused in policy or law. The things that the public wants are not necessarily the things that the public gets in regards to politics. In fact, usually it's not. Usually the public is ignored in politics, with the party who they believe in saying, well, the other party stopped me from doing it. The issue is class, not race. And look, and don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that there aren't some racist people in this world. And that doesn't mean that the police departments, the structural racism, those things that exist in the country are not problematic. They're immensely problematic. They are immensely problematic. Those things need to be torn down. Part and parcel to that is our economic system, though, because it creates these kind of expendable people, people who we need to throw away, people who become somewhat of a business asset. We don't have work for the people who were essentially built the nation. We don't have work for all of these people who essentially gave up of trying to get a job. We don't have anything for them. So we can house those people in cages. Part of the reason your prison population is the way it is because your population has decided to just give up on a large segment of that population. You're warehousing people in cages. It's amazing. The amount of money that the government pays for those prisons, they can just pay the people directly. Let's get the people a job. Give them something to do. Put them somewhere to work for the greater good. You can put cash in their pocket to do something better. Those people are going to come out of prison and go right back into doing whatever they were doing. The constituent issues that got them to the prison in the first place have not changed. You've made their life more difficult because now they have a prison record. That's the reality of it. You've made their life harder. You've given them more of an opportunity to end back up in prison. Your best bet would be to use prison as a last resort, not the first. It damages your society materially. It damages the individual materially. To do something like that, to put them in prison over some stupid shit like like a bill, or because people do get put in prison for bills. We do have a debtor's prison in this country. Try not paying a ticket and see what happens. One charge after the next, after the next, after the next, and eventually they pick up the person who couldn't afford to pay the first ticket, and that person gets put in prison. Something like obstructing court or something like that. It's essentially a debtor's prison. Essentially a debtor's prison. Yeah, man. I'm gonna end it at that. I keep saying the problem is capitalism. The problem is our model. We incentivize maximizing profit, individual profit, essentially the greed at the expense of everybody else. That's going to always be a problem, whatever system you take that to. If your main goal or the values that are set in people, meaning when you program the people in your society, one birth after the next, what are the values that you're digging into them? And do you believe that the values you're digging into them are somehow stronger than the values that the media, that real life is digging into them? Your value system is going to fail miserably compared to what takes place for them needing to survive. Meaning how you arrange your society itself. Getting rid of that, this person is desperate to survive. Getting rid of that from your society materially transforms your society. I'll leave it at that. Human beings have value, man. That value should be espoused in law. For however long that value is ignored and not espoused, meaning you allowing those people to go without having certain lacks. This person needs X. That person is not getting X. The person needs Y. The person is not getting Y. Your society is going to suffer plagues. You can have whatever society you want. You just have to be willing to deal with the consequences of the arrangement of that society. You can have a capitalistic society where the goal is individual greed and profit. Just beware that what the people are going to do are going to try to maximize their individual greed and profit, meaning it's going to run wild. That's going to be the methodology running your culture. That is the methodology running our culture. That needs to change. Chicken and the egg. Somehow the value system needs to come to some kind of cathartic crisis. That's the part that scares me, because I don't know what that crisis is. But it has to be something relevant enough where the people fundamentally shift how they look at things, their perspective, and fundamentally reorganize their society to embolden that new perspective, meaning creating a new paradigm and creating society in the way that persists that paradigm. When this crashes, this is going to be ancient Rome for somebody else. Hopefully they've learned the lessons from us. So, alright guys, if you enjoy the content, feel free to share, rate, subscribe, and of course, you can always support the work through Patreon. I'm going to try to come to some way of organizing these in a way that's more predictable, I guess. So, alright guys, everybody, have a good one. I don't know how many people stay with me on this. This was random as random could be. I mainly want to talk about the Bannon case. I'm going to put his information at the bottom so people can read it. Have a good one, guys.